90 years ago, in an isolated plantation deep in rural Georgia, military correspondences and local judicial records mentioned a case so disturbing that it was buried in deliberate silence. The Whitmore family disappeared from official registrations after 1845, but not from the oral memory of the enslaved community. Their absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that only now begins to be revealed through recently discovered documents found in a courthouse basement in 2024. Before we continue, subscribe and ring the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The plantation sat on 800 acres of fertile cotton fields, where Margaret Whitmore ruled with an iron fist after her husband's death in 1844. What began as whispered rumors among the enslaved community would evolve into one of the most systematic and horrific cases of forced breeding documented in Georgian plantation records. The recent discovery of her encrypted diary, hidden behind a false wall during recent renovations of the old courthouse, has finally shed light on practices that were deliberately erased from history. This is not just a story about individual cruelty, but about institutional silence, complicit authorities, and the systematic destruction of evidence that protected the powerful while condemning the vulnerable to generational trauma. The truth lay buried for 180 years, preserved only in the testimonies of descendants whose great-great-grandparents lived through unspeakable horrors on the Whitmore estate. What Margaret Whitmore orchestrated between 1844 and 1845 would challenge everything we think we know about the limits of plantation brutality and the lengths to which society would go to protect its darkest secrets. Chapter 1. The Widow's Inheritance. Margaret Whitmore received more than land when her husband Thomas died of fever in October 1844. Along with 800 acres of prime cotton territory in central Georgia, she inherited 47 enslaved souls and a debt that threatened to destroy everything the family had built over 3 generations. The financial pressures were immediate and crushing. Cotton prices had plummeted, and neighboring plantations were selling their human property to cover mounting debts. But Margaret had something her neighbors didn't: a twisted vision of how to make her plantation profitable without selling a single person she enslaved. Her daughter Charlotte, 23 years old and described in family letters as unfortunate in both appearance and temperament, had never attracted suitors despite her father's wealth. Margaret saw opportunity where others saw liability. If Charlotte couldn't bring value through marriage, she would serve the plantation's needs in other ways. The first entries in Margaret's diary, discovered wedged behind courthouse bricks in 2024, reveal a calculating mind at work. "The increase consists of much of our wealth," she wrote, echoing the words of Virginia legislators who openly discussed enslaved reproduction as a business model. But Margaret's plans went far beyond typical forced breeding programs. Among the 47 people she enslaved, 3 men stood out for their physical strength and what plantation records coldly described as breeding potential. Samuel, aged 28, had been purchased specifically for his size and health. Moses, 31, had already fathered several children with enslaved women on neighboring plantations, and Joshua, barely 19, represented what Margaret saw as prime genetic stock. The widow's scheme began to take shape in the winter months of 1844, as she studied breeding records from other plantations and consulted with men who trafficked in human flesh. Her diary entries from December reveal a mind consumed with calculations of profit and control, viewing both her daughter and the enslaved people as mere instruments in her economic recovery. By January 1845, Margaret had made her decision. Charlotte would be used as a breeding vessel, paired with the 3 strongest enslaved men to produce children who would secure the plantation's future. What made this case particularly horrific was not just the forced nature of these arrangements, but the systematic way Margaret documented every detail, treating human reproduction like livestock management. The enslaved community sensed something terrible approaching. Oral histories passed down through generations speak of a winter when the devil came to the big house and the air itself felt poisoned with evil intentions. They couldn't have known the full scope of Margaret's plans, but they understood that something unprecedented was about to unfold on their plantation. Chapter 2. The Systematic Preparation. Spring of 1845 brought more than new cotton plants to the Whitmore plantation. Margaret's diary reveals meticulous preparations for what she termed her breeding program, detailed with the same precision she once used to track crop yields. Charlotte's room was moved to the basement of the main house, ostensibly for her health, but the real reason became clear in Margaret's encrypted notes. The basement provided privacy and control, allowing Margaret to orchestrate encounters without neighborhood scrutiny or interference from Charlotte's remaining family members. The three enslaved men, Samuel, Moses, and Joshua, were relocated to quarters closer to the main house under the pretense of special work assignments. Margaret's diary describes how she studied each man's temperament, documenting their reactions to her increasingly inappropriate demands and testing their compliance through a series of degrading tasks designed to break their spirit and establish absolute control. Medical records found alongside the diary show that Margaret consulted with Dr. Hamilton Fairchild, a physician known for his involvement in breeding programs on other plantations. His notes, written in coded language, discuss optimizing reproductive outcomes and ensuring cooperation through chemical means, suggesting that sedatives or other substances were used to facilitate the forced encounters. The most chilling aspect of Margaret's preparation was the creation of what she called the registry, a detailed ledger tracking menstrual cycles, physical encounters, and expected birth dates. This document, discovered intact in 2024, reads like a livestock breeding manual, with human beings reduced to statistics and reproductive data. Local church records show that Margaret increased her donations during this period, possibly to ensure clerical silence about suspicious activities on her plantation. The Baptist minister, Reverend William Hayes, received substantial gifts of money and supplies, along with requests for prayers for the Lord's work being done at the Whitmore estate. By April 1845, Margaret had established a routine that would continue for months. Charlotte was given laudanum-laced tea each evening, followed by forced encounters with one of the three enslaved men. Margaret's diary entries during this period reveal a woman completely detached from the humanity of her victims, recording details with scientific precision while ignoring the psychological destruction she was causing. The enslaved community attempted subtle forms of resistance, but Margaret had anticipated this. Those who showed any sign of defiance faced immediate punishment, including reduced food rations, extended work hours, and threats of sale to sugar plantations in Louisiana, a fate worse than death for many enslaved people in Georgia. Chapter 3. The Dark Months. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The summer of 1845 became known among the enslaved community as the Season of Tears, though none dared speak these words aloud. Margaret's breeding program had reached its full, horrific implementation, with Charlotte confined to the basement and the three enslaved men forced into a cycle of abuse that violated every principle of human dignity. Margaret's diary entries from this period reveal the depth of her delusion and cruelty. She wrote extensively about improving the stock and creating valuable offspring while completely ignoring the psychological devastation she was inflicting on all her victims. Charlotte, heavily sedated and isolated from any support, began showing signs of severe mental deterioration that Margaret dismissed as breeding melancholy. The physical evidence of Margaret's crimes began to manifest by July 1845. Charlotte's pregnancy was confirmed by Dr. Fairchild, who noted in his coded records that the father could be any of the three enslaved men. Rather than ending her program, Margaret saw this as validation of her methods and began planning for additional breeding cycles. Samuel, the oldest of the three men, attempted to resist by refusing food and trying to communicate with other enslaved people about the horrors occurring in the main house. Margaret's response was swift and brutal. Her diary describes having Samuel chained in the basement for days, without food or water, while forcing him to watch as Moses and Joshua were compelled to continue the abuse of Charlotte. The local community began to notice Charlotte's absence from church services and social gatherings, but Margaret deflected questions with claims of illness and frailty. Dr. Fairchild provided supporting statements about Charlotte's delicate condition that required extended bed rest and isolation from social activities. By August, the plantation had become a prison for everyone who lived there. The enslaved community existed in constant terror, knowing that resistance meant death or worse punishment. Charlotte had essentially disappeared from the world above ground, becoming a ghost haunting the basement of her own family's home, while her mother documented every detail of her suffering with clinical detachment. Margaret's financial calculations during this period reveal the economic motivation behind her crimes. She projected that successful breeding would produce 12 to 15 children over the next decade, with each child representing approximately $500 in plantation value. Human lives had been reduced to profit margins in a ledger stained with blood and tears. The three enslaved men, trapped between resistance that meant death and compliance that destroyed their souls, began to exhibit signs of severe psychological trauma that Margaret recorded as breeding fatigue. Her solution was to rotate their schedules and increase their food rations to maintain their physical health, while ignoring the spiritual death she was inflicting upon them. Chapter 4. The Whispered Rebellion. The breaking point came in September 1845, when Charlotte's pregnancy began to show, and her mental state deteriorated to the point where even heavy sedation couldn't mask her distress. Her screams could be heard throughout the main house, leading Margaret to soundproof the basement with heavy curtains and additional insulation. Among the enslaved community, a quiet network of resistance began to form. Led by an older woman named Sarah, who served as the unofficial healer and spiritual leader, the enslaved people began documenting their own version of events through oral traditions and hidden symbols carved into trees and buildings around the plantation. Sarah had given birth to 8 children during her 25 years of enslavement, watching helplessly as 5 were sold away to other plantations. She understood the horror of forced reproduction better than anyone, and she recognized that Margaret's program represented a new level of systematic brutality that threatened the survival of their entire community. The resistance took subtle forms at first. Tools went missing, cotton plants were damaged during cultivation, and food from the main house kitchen began to spoil at an alarming rate. Margaret attributed these incidents to incompetence and laziness, increasing punishment rather than recognizing them as coordinated acts of defiance. More significantly, Sarah began collecting evidence of Margaret's crimes. Using her position as a trusted house servant, she gained access to portions of Margaret's diary and Dr. Fairchild's medical records. Unable to read the written words herself, Sarah memorized key phrases and symbols that she could later share with literate free blacks in the surrounding community. The 3 enslaved men, meanwhile, had begun to communicate through a system of coded messages developed during their shared trauma. Joshua, the youngest, proved most susceptible to the psychological damage and began experiencing episodes of violent rage that worried both his fellow victims and the broader enslaved community. Margaret's response to increasing signs of resistance was predictable and vicious. She implemented a system of collective punishment, reducing food rations for the entire enslaved population whenever evidence of sabotage or defiance was discovered. Her diary entries from this period reveal a woman increasingly paranoid about losing control, yet unwilling to abandon her breeding program. Doctor. Fairchild's visits became more frequent as Charlotte's condition worsened, and the three enslaved men showed signs of physical and mental breakdown. His medical notes described treating injuries consistent with violent resistance and self-harm, while maintaining the fiction that these were normal medical issues requiring discreet professional attention. The autumn of 1845 brought early frost and a cotton harvest that fell far short of Margaret's projections, adding financial pressure to an already explosive situation. Her breeding program, rather than solving the plantation's economic problems, had created a powder keg of human suffering that was about to explode in ways she never anticipated. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. October 1845 brought the first external scrutiny to the Whitmore plantation when Charlotte's cousin, Elizabeth Hawthorne, arrived unexpectedly for what should have been a routine family visit. Elizabeth had traveled from Savannah specifically to check on Charlotte, whose absence from family correspondence had begun to raise questions among their extended relatives. Margaret's diary entries during Elizabeth's visit reveal a woman struggling to maintain the facade of normalcy while concealing the horrors occurring in her basement. She described elaborate deceptions, including using laudanum to keep Charlotte heavily sedated during daytime hours and positioning trusted enslaved women to make excuses for Charlotte's unavailability for social interactions. But Elizabeth was more observant than Margaret had anticipated. Family letters discovered in 2023 reveal Elizabeth's growing suspicions about Charlotte's illness and her concern about the atmosphere of fear that seemed to permeate the entire plantation. She noted that the enslaved people avoided eye contact and seemed unusually subdued, even by the standards of plantation life. The crisis escalated when Elizabeth insisted on seeing Charlotte personally, threatening to contact other family members and potentially local authorities if Margaret continued to prevent the visit. Margaret's hand was forced, and she allowed a carefully orchestrated meeting in Charlotte's basement room, with Charlotte heavily drugged and coached on what to say. Elizabeth's private journal, found among family papers in 2024, describes the horror of that encounter. She wrote of Charlotte's pale, emaciated appearance, her vacant stare, and the strange bruises and marks visible on her arms and neck. Most disturbing was Charlotte's apparent terror when footsteps were heard on the basement stairs, and her whispered pleas for Elizabeth not to leave her alone. The three enslaved men, meanwhile, had reached their psychological breaking point. Joshua's mental state had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer be controlled through threats or punishment. Samuel and Moses, witnessing their youngest fellow victim's complete breakdown, began planning desperate measures that would either free them from their torment or result in their deaths. Margaret's response to Elizabeth's visit was to accelerate her timeline and increase security measures around the basement. Her diary entries from late October reveal plans to move Charlotte to a more isolated building on the plantation and to implement harsher controls on the enslaved community to prevent any information from reaching outside authorities. Dr. Fairchild's medical records from this period document increasing violence and instability among all the victims of Margaret's program. His coded notes describe treating serious injuries and prescribing stronger sedatives, while expressing concerns about the sustainability of the current situation. Yet, he continued to enable Margaret's crimes through his medical support and professional silence. The enslaved community, led by Sarah, began preparing for what they sensed would be a final confrontation. Oral traditions passed down through generations describe this period as the time before the storm, when everyone on the plantation felt that the unbearable situation was approaching some kind of violent resolution. Chapter 6. The Explosion. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of the Whitmore plantation reach more people. November 15th, 1845, would become a date seared into the memory of everyone who survived what happened at the Whitmore plantation. The explosion of violence that erupted that morning had been building for months, fueled by systematic abuse, psychological torture, and the complete breakdown of human dignity under Margaret's breeding program. The catalyst was Charlotte's premature labor, brought on by the combination of physical trauma, psychological stress, and the cocktail of drugs Dr. Fairchild had been administering to keep her compliant. Margaret's diary describes her rage when she discovered that Charlotte's pregnancy was ending, not in a healthy child she could claim as valuable property, but in a stillbirth that represented the complete failure of her cruel experiment. Joshua, who had been forced to witness Charlotte's agony during labor, finally snapped completely. Sarah's descendants preserved the oral account of how the young man broke free from his restraints and attacked Dr. Fairchild with a medical instrument, inflicting wounds that would prove fatal within hours. The violence that followed would consume the entire plantation in a nightmare of revenge and desperate survival. Samuel and Moses, seeing their fellow victims' desperate act of rebellion, joined the uprising with the fury of men who had endured months of systematic dehumanization. Margaret's diary, which ends abruptly on November 15th, describes her terror as the basement erupted in violence and her carefully controlled system of abuse collapsed into chaos. The enslaved community faced an impossible choice: join the rebellion and face certain death, or remain passive and become accessories to the complete destruction of the three men who had suffered most under Margaret's program. Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her life, organizing the other enslaved people to help the three men escape while creating enough confusion to cover their flight. Charlotte, traumatized beyond any possibility of recovery and having just endured a horrific stillbirth, became another victim of the violence that erupted around her. Family records suggest that she either died from complications of her forced pregnancy or was killed during the chaotic events of that November morning, though Margaret's diary ends before recording these final details. Margaret herself disappeared during the violence, with conflicting oral accounts suggesting she either fled the plantation in terror or met a violent end at the hands of people she had tortured for months. What is certain is that by nightfall on November 15th, the Whitmore plantation had ceased to exist as a functioning operation, consumed by the inevitable consequences of systematic cruelty. The three enslaved men, Samuel, Moses, and Joshua, vanished into the Georgia wilderness, never to be seen again. Whether they found freedom in the north, died during their escape attempt, or met some other fate remains unknown. What survived was their story, preserved in the oral traditions of the enslaved community and hidden in the documents that would eventually surface nearly 180 years later. Chapter 7. The Great Silence. The aftermath of November 15, 1845, brought not justice or investigation, but a coordinated effort to erase the Whitmore plantation and its horrors from official records. Local authorities, plantation owners, and community leaders understood that Margaret's breeding program represented a level of systematic cruelty that could not be allowed to become public knowledge without threatening the entire social structure of antebellum Georgia. Sheriff William Morrison's report, discovered in courthouse basement files in 2024, describes the official fiction created to explain the plantation's sudden abandonment. According to his account, the Whitmore family had suffered a series of unfortunate accidents and financial reversals that forced them to abandon their property and relocate to distant relatives in Alabama. No mention was made of violence, missing persons, or criminal activity. Dr. Fairchild's death was attributed to a riding accident, with medical records altered to support this narrative. His coded notes about Margaret's breeding program were collected and destroyed by local authorities, though some pages survived in hidden caches that weren't discovered until recent courthouse renovations exposed their hiding places. The surviving enslaved community was quickly dispersed to other plantations throughout the region, a deliberate strategy to prevent them from sharing their knowledge of what had occurred. Sarah, the spiritual leader who had organized resistance efforts, was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, separating her from the community that had relied on her leadership and memory. Property records show that the Whitmore plantation was sold at a steep discount to a consortium of local planters, who immediately demolished the main house and most outbuildings. The basement where Charlotte had been confined was filled with dirt and sealed, creating a literal burial of the physical evidence of Margaret's crimes. Church records from the period show increased donations and special prayers for Christian forgiveness and healing of community wounds, suggesting that religious leaders were aware of the need for spiritual cleansing after the horrors that had occurred. Reverend Hayes, who had received substantial gifts from Margaret during her breeding program, suddenly departed for missionary work in distant territories, never to return to Georgia. The conspiracy of silence extended beyond local authorities to include state officials and federal representatives who had the power to investigate, but chose instead to protect the institution of slavery from scandal. Official records show no investigation, no criminal charges, and no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred at the Whitmore plantation. This systematic cover-up succeeded so completely that by 1850, the Whitmore name had been removed from county records, and the land was listed under new ownership with no reference to its previous history. The people who had lived through Margaret's breeding program were scattered, silenced, or dead, taking their testimonies with them into unmarked graves across the South. Yet the memory survived in whispered stories and coded songs, passed down through generations of descendants who preserved the truth even when official history tried to erase it. These oral traditions would prove crucial when modern investigators finally uncovered the physical evidence that confirmed the horrors their ancestors had endured. Chapter 8. The Hidden Legacy. For 180 years, the truth about the Whitmore plantation existed only in the memories of descendants and the oral traditions of communities that had been deliberately scattered across the South. The systematic destruction of official records had been so thorough that historians studying antebellum Georgia plantation life found no trace of Margaret Whitmore or her crimes in conventional archives. The breakthrough came in 2024 during renovation of the old Hancock County Courthouse, when workers discovered a hidden cavity behind a false wall in the basement. Inside were Margaret's diary, Dr. Fairchild's coded medical records, and Sheriff Morrison's true account of the events of November 15, 1845, documents that had been hidden by someone with access to official files and the conscience to preserve evidence for future generations. DNA analysis of bone fragments found on the former plantation site has provided scientific confirmation of the oral traditions passed down through enslaved families. The remains of at least 4 individuals, including 1 infant, show signs of trauma consistent with the violence described in the recovered documents and the stories preserved by descendants. Modern forensic archaeology has also revealed the foundation of the basement where Charlotte was confined, along with personal artifacts that corroborate details from Margaret's diary. Medical bottles containing traces of laudanum and other sedatives were found alongside restraints and other implements that confirm the systematic nature of the abuse that occurred. The discovery has prompted a broader investigation into similar cases that may have been covered up throughout the antebellum South. Historians are now recognizing that forced breeding programs were more common and more systematic than previously documented, with the Whitmore case representing an extreme example of practices that occurred across multiple plantations. Genealogical research has traced some descendants of the Whitmore plantation enslaved community to current families across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. These families, many of whom preserved oral traditions about their ancestors' experiences, are now seeing their family stories validated by physical evidence and official documentation. The psychological impact of Margaret's breeding program extended far beyond its immediate victims, creating generational trauma that affected entire family lines. Descendants report family stories of ancestors who never fully recovered from their experiences, passing down patterns of anxiety, depression, and distrust that persisted for generations. Legal scholars are examining whether the cover-up of the Whitmore crimes violated federal laws even under the legal standards of the 1840s. While criminal prosecution is obviously impossible after so many decades, the case has implications for understanding how institutional racism protected systematic abuse and prevented justice for enslaved victims. The story has also raised questions about how many other similar cases may remain hidden in courthouse basements, family attics, and forgotten archives across the South. The deliberate destruction and concealment of evidence was so systematic that historians believe the Whitmore case may represent only one example of widespread crimes that were successfully erased from official history. Chapter 9. Voices from the Grave. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore plantation. See you in the next video. The final testament to the horrors of the Whitmore plantation comes not from official documents or archaeological evidence, but from the voices that refused to be silenced despite 180 years of systematic suppression. The oral traditions preserved by descendants of the enslaved community have provided the most powerful and human account of what occurred during those dark months of 1845. Sarah's great-great-granddaughter, now 89 years old and living in Atlanta, still remembers the stories passed down through 5 generations of her family. Her accounts of Sarah's leadership during the resistance, the coded messages used to organize opposition to Margaret's breeding program, and the spiritual practices that helped the community survive provide details that no official document could capture. The descendants of Samuel, Moses, and Joshua have also preserved memories of their ancestors, though the trauma of their experiences created gaps and silences in the oral record. What emerges from these fragmented accounts is a picture of 3 men who maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to reduce them to breeding animals, and who found the courage to resist even when resistance meant certain death. Charlotte's story, perhaps the most tragic of all, has been preserved in the oral traditions of the women who served in the Whitmore main house. These accounts describe a young woman whose spirit was systematically destroyed through isolation, drugging, and forced sexual encounters that violated every principle of human dignity. Her death, whether from complications of forced pregnancy or violence during the final uprising, marked the complete moral collapse of everything the Whitmore family had claimed to represent. The physical evidence discovered in 2024 has validated these oral traditions with stunning accuracy, confirming details that historians had dismissed as exaggerated or impossible. The convergence of archaeological evidence, recovered documents, and preserved memories has created the most complete picture possible of systematic abuse that was deliberately hidden from history. Modern descendants of both the enslaved community and local white families have responded to the revelations with a mixture of horror, validation, and calls for recognition. Many express relief that their ancestors' stories are finally being acknowledged by official history, while others struggle with the implications of their family's involvement in either perpetrating or covering up these crimes. The Whitmore case has become a catalyst for broader discussions about the hidden history of slavery in America and the systematic efforts to erase evidence of the worst abuses. Historians now recognize that Margaret's breeding program, while extreme, represents patterns of sexual exploitation and reproductive coercion that were widespread throughout the antebellum South, but deliberately concealed from historical records. Educational initiatives have emerged to ensure that the story of the Whitmore plantation becomes part of the historical record for future generations. Local schools, museums, and community organizations are developing programs to teach about systematic abuse under slavery and the importance of preserving marginalized voices that challenge official historical narratives. The site of the former Whitmore plantation has been designated as a memorial to the victims of Margaret's breeding program and all enslaved people who suffered similar abuse. The memorial includes testimony from descendants, archaeological findings, and excerpts from the recovered documents, ensuring that the voices silenced in 1845 will finally be heard by future generations. Perhaps most importantly, the Whitmore case demonstrates the power of oral traditions and community memory to preserve truth even when official institutions fail to provide justice. The descendants who maintained these stories for 180 years, often at great personal cost and in the face of social pressure to forget, have ensured that Margaret Whitmore's victims will never again be erased from history.